Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And yeah, it's 12:02. So welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me. Um, Thank you for joining us for today's event, APAP Arts Forward, our monthly reopening webinar. My name is Krista Bradley. I'm the Director of Programs and Resources at the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. Closed captioning will appear automatically on your screen. If you would like to disable the chat transcript, please click More, as shown on the next slide, on the bottom of the Zoom window, and hide subtitles. APAP is located in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Anacostan people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would like to pay my respect to the Piscataway and the Anacostan elders, both past and present. Participants on today's webinar will have the opportunity to ask questions and provide comments using the Q&A and chat functions. If you have questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A box. APAP is your go-to resource for the connections and resources you need to build your career as a performing arts professional in the presenting, booking, and touring field. Join APAP as we move the arts forward. We know that right now many in our field are still recovering from the impacts of the pandemic. For that reason, APAP is offering flexible, no barriers membership through June 2022. If you are interested in joining APAP, and we hope you are, and learning more about our flexible membership rates, please contact us at info@apap365.org. And now let's get started. Today's session is part of our Arts Forward program initiative, made possible with generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. APAP's Arts Forward program supports the presenting and booking and touring field's safe, vibrant, and equitable reopening and recovery as presenters, artists, and audiences reconnect, tours resume, and venues reopen. On February 9th, 2022, APAP launched the APAP ArtsForward Reopening Survey with research partners AMS Planning and Research. This important 8-month-long initiative will gather invaluable longitudinal data from performing arts presenters, venues, agents, managers, producers, and artists, and track field-wide trends in reopening and resuming our field. The resulting report will provide the industry with national and regional data to inform decision-making as presenters, producers, artists, and audience reconnect and tours restart and venues reopen with full attendance capacity. Today, we'll be learning findings from the first deployment of this reopening survey, which was administered to venues and presenting organizations. APAP and AMS Planning and Research will be hosting a series of monthly Arts Forward Reopening Survey update webinars like this one to report on findings from each month's survey to the field. We will run this survey until September and will deploy the survey to different facets of our sector every other month. The survey for the next round will launch next month, and you'll hear more details about that. So for now, I want to express our gratitude again to the Mellon Foundation for their support and our deep appreciation for AMS Planning and Research for their partnership and leadership. We are joined today by Stephen Wolf, Principal at AMS Planning and Research, and Christian Wolf, Project Manager at AMS Planning and Research, who will lead us through the findings. So Stephen and Christian, welcome.
Thank you, Krista, and thanks so much for putting this program together. It's an important program. I'm Steve Wolf, as Krista mentioned, the principal of AMS Planning and Research. I'm coming to you from Connecticut, the ancestral lands of the Abenaki, and we recognize their elders, past and present, who have stewarded this land through generations. I'm a white male. Christian says I have graying hair. I'm wearing a gray vest and a blue plaid shirt today. We're going to take you very quickly, I think, through some methodology, share some of the key findings in what is the first of these 8 administrations. So this is really just baseline work. It's hard to draw a lot of conclusions here. And then we're really interested in your questions and inquiry. So Krista mentioned that this research is a 2-part process supported by the Mellon Foundation. We're working with 2 different samples. In this first survey, we're focused on venues and presenters. And if you will, in the odd numbered months, 1, 3, 5, and 7, we will be collecting data from this cohort. In the even numbered months, the survey will be slightly different, and we'll focus on the experiences that agents and artists are having. We're really interested in reopening status, conditions, particularly around health and safety and how that might impact work, the volume of activity, both being presented and being made available, challenges and opportunities in the field. AMS for the last 20 odd months has been working in a partnership with Wolf Brown on the Audience Outlook Monitor, which many of you may be aware of. From time to time, we will bring in some data that illustrates the audience side of what we're seeing in this organizational survey, just for contrast. If you'd like more information about AOM, please feel free to go to ams-analytics.com. There's more information there. So for our first survey here, our goal, our real research objective here, is to help the field more effectively reopen, because we're not going back to where we were, but we're going to somewhere new. In addition to APAP members, the presenters and venues survey went to lists that were provided to us by New England Presenters, Mid-Atlantic Arts, and South Arts. We had a response of 389. We're quite pleased with that. It gives us a confidence interval of about 90%. So if we reissued the survey to the same list, 9 out of 10 times we could expect it to be the same. Along with the invitation to participate, did come the opportunity to participate in a panel survey. We would like very much to have as many of the respondents as possible take all 4 of the surveys, so that we can have good longitudinal data. And we will be in touch with those of you who indicated that you were. There is an opportunity for a drawing at the end if you do all 4 of these surveys in a timely fashion for both some gift cards and registrations to the next conference. So who did we hear from this time? We had a good distribution across the country, just about a third in the Northeast, 27% in the South, 18% in the Midwest, and 20% in the West Coast, about 41% in urban settings, and just about 50% in either rural or suburban settings. About 2/3 were presenters with presenter and venue operators combined, presenters with venues, if you will. About 20% were presenter only. And you'll see that we look at some of this data as we start to go through the information. From there, I'll allow Christian to introduce himself, and he'll take you through the first set of data about activity and attendance.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, my name is Christian Otten. I'm a project manager with AMS Planning and Research. Pleasure to be with all of you. I'm a brown-haired, I suppose, approaching middle-aged male at this point, and I'm wearing a blue button-down and a zip-up vest. Want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing thus far, and we're really looking forward to the longitudinal data as Stephen has alluded to, but we will be peppering in some of the audience perspective from our AOM study as we take a look at how the venues are behaving and what things are going on early in this first quarter of 2022. Many of the presenters and the venues that were surveyed are involved in a variety of different genres, but particularly involved in presenting dance in a variety of different musical styles, family programming, those sort of things. But we do want to call out the kind of preponderance of musical offerings from the perspective of the presenters, which may prove to be pretty important. And certainly down the road here, we'll be diving more into what that might mean in terms of the future for presenters in those particular areas of presentation. When we look at what is going on in terms of activity and the type of activity, particularly around those that are offering full capacity performances at the moment, we've got about half of the sample, a little bit over half, that says that they're currently offering those full capacity performances. And our backdated work has shown us that that has actually been relatively consistent even throughout the Omicron variant for about half of the field since September of 2021. That said, there is a portion of the presenting world that is awaiting a full capacity offering, and that is very regionally different as well. When we look at the Northeast, there certainly is a lower percentage of venues and presenters in the Northeast that are currently offering full capacity performances, whereas there are many more in that region that are planning to offer those full capacity performances come the summer. In other regions throughout the country, it's driven a little bit more by offering full capacity currently, but there is a little bit of a spread as well. In terms of actual activity in the last 30 days, we've observed from the survey that we've got about 7 in 10 organizations across the field that only had a chance to offer less than 10 performances in the month of late January through late February here, the study period. And this includes 20% who did not offer any performances of any kind in person. This represents to us about a 50% reduction compared to our baseline of 2019 activity, which was submitted by the respondents. We were seeing an average of about 16, just over 16 events on a monthly basis. And that's been reduced to about an average across the spread here of just over 8 performances, which is inclusive of that 70% or so that have offered less than 10 in the period that's been studied, primarily due to the impacts of the Omicron variant. So we're curious to see what happens in the coming months as that impact wanes across much of the country. We wanted to take a look at some specific analysis groups. We understand the sample to be divided out into, as Stephen mentioned early on, presenters and venues, presenters that control venues, presenters that do not control venues, and then venues who are not presenters. And we see that about half of the venues, or half of the presenters that control venues, as well as the venues themselves that do not present, are able to control and essentially push more activity through the venues, even through the challenges of the Omicron variant in late January and early February. And this activity is also much more robust in the South and the Midwest regions than it is in the Northeast and in the West, based on the reporting. So this is a really interesting observation that the presenters that own venues, or the organizations that own and control venues, are able to make, I guess, have more agency, we might suppose, around how much activity occurs in their venue.
And we'll be looking in a little bit about how the audience response parallels this, right, Christian, in those.
That's right. Mm-hmm. We wanted to take a look at some forward-looking sales and understand how things are looking at the moment when it comes to subscription sales and single ticket sales as well, in comparison to the last full season, which we have left to the respondent to determine, but commonly is understood to be the full operating year of 2019 was the last time that there was a full slate of activity for many of these organizations. So subscription sales in particular are very well behind, and we saw a lot of comments about how subscription sales are lagging, particularly in the Northeast region, but across the board, 7 in 10 organizations report that their subscription sales are behind. An interesting small portion are reporting say subscription sales ahead, but the bulk are reporting that they're the same or behind. And that is also quite regionally specific. And as you can see, the coasts are reporting subscription sales that are behind at higher rates. Oops. Single ticket sales, similar reporting, if not a little bit more bleak, I suppose. That said, the southern region is certainly seeing a little bit better sales overall. Only about 64% of those in those organizations in the southern region are reporting sales that are behind, as compared to that aggregate of 77%.
And just to pause here for a second, Christian, we think this is one of the really early takeaways, which is why while we are returning, right, we're not turning the switch back on. We're going to have to recover over time here. And we have this one point from the AOM data from February about 9,000 responses, 8,000 or 9,000 responses, where only half of prior purchasers were indicating that they had made any purchases in roughly the same time period. So we'll definitely take a look at that and monitor this as we go ahead, because you're going to see some other data here in just a second that's going to suggest that as organizations, we've moved forward perhaps faster than those who participate in our work.
Absolutely. Really important observation in terms of the audience perspective on this, and we'll see that more going forward. Drop count, also a really important indicator of how audiences are feeling and behaving in conjunction with our Audience Outlook Monitor study. Pretty interesting to see how this sits regionally, but in an aggregate sense, about half of the organizations report drop counts that are lower. That means that there are fewer ticket buyers that are actually attending the in-person performances in this case. So that, again, may not be super surprising at the aggregate level, that about half are feeling uncomfortable come the day of show, or don't attend for whatever reason come day of show, more than they would pre-pandemic. And these regional lines are really interesting, and we'll also take a look at some of the AOM data in relationship to this later on. But it is important to call out that Western region, and perhaps, and the Midwest for that matter, but particularly in the West, where the drop counts are much lower, and perhaps beg the question of why these patrons are buying tickets and then feeling uncomfortable come the day of the show. So we'll get to that later, perhaps some answers. We also wanted to understand content from a non-ticketed perspective. Obviously, the ticketed material and activity is really important indicator for the future, and yet there is also all this other stuff that's going on that presenters and venues are active in providing to their communities and supporting artists. That is happening in volume here, and certainly we've heard a lot about the impact of online content, much of which the economics don't particularly benefit the organization's bottom line in any substantial way, but they're still offering this sort of touch point with the organization to this day. And I think oftentimes we find that has endured since March of 2020 or April of 2020. But about half report that they are providing this online content. And additionally, we see about 35% offering non-gated events of any variety. There's also a number of organizations that report doing all sorts of work to support artists and give visibility to artists that is not ticketed. Residencies, workshops for artists, school programs, those sort of things, as well as direct financial and social support for artists, which is an interesting observation as well. So the field is supporting the artists. I'm going to go ahead.
That's a good segue, Christian, to move and talk a little bit about the workforce. Thanks for setting me up with such a softball. So one of the things that we have been monitoring closely for 20 months and is included in this survey is to understand how our workforce is coming back to work such that they are, and this is going to be really important longitudinal data for us. So one of the first things we looked at was staff return, and as you can see on the slide, we're pretty close to all full-time staff pre-pandemic levels of full-time staff being being back in place. And there's an important note that we're seeing here, which is that our compensation levels have gone up significantly, as have other expenses. And so one of the interesting questions that I think we're going to want to explore, I saw it in the chat briefly, is how the underlying math has changed, not just the level of activity and rates of attendance, but the underlying math on the expense side. And that's something we'll certainly think about as we go forward to the next iterations of this survey. We looked to see if there were regional differences or market differences in the rates of staff returning, and it pretty much correlates to average activity as relates to part-time people. You'll remember on the earlier slide, we said about 2/3 of part-time headcount was back, and you can see the big difference here between the Northeast and the South, for example. Southern states are particularly advantaged with good weather. A lot of venues found ways to do creative stuff outdoors as well as indoors. So they tended to ramp up with their personnel more quickly than some of the other phases. The workforce itself, everybody, significant numbers of folks expressed concerns about changes in the workforce and the supply. Christian, we can go, thank you, to one more slide. The very, very interesting set of factors here. I would also refer everybody to a wonderful piece of work done by a colleague of ours, Meg Friedman, and partner David, I always forget his last name, it's not Morris, David
McGrath.
at Elon University.
McGrath.
Thank you, David McGrath, which I know APAP has featured before, returned to the stage to learn more about what's happening in this space. But we're looking at significant number of organizations indicating that supply is a question, working conditions are a question, compensation are a question. I think this is a pretty fundamental shift in our industry that perhaps we weren't expecting on the backside of the pandemic, at the same time that we're addressing the really significant call for change in equity, diversity, access, and inclusion. So it's a complicated time that we're returning to, and it'll be interesting to track that. One of the other things that we were interested in this survey was to see particularly how federal and state support made its way into our sector. The data show that about half of our respondents received a Shuttered Venues Operators grant. About half received some flow-through CARES Act funding or other state and local funding. That about a quarter raised direct operational funding for COVID relief, and 1 in 5 had some other source, including PPP. We're going to do some other analysis on this data with some other data sources we have access to, and we'll be reporting back more on it going forward. I don't think this is actually a longitudinal question we're going to follow, because most of these programs are now pretty much complete. But this whole notion about the workforce and return has got two pieces going to it. One, we're largely back with our full-time staff, but we're not doing as much activity or with as much volume as we used to. And two, we're facing a lot of pressure in filling positions, compensating those positions, and what the working conditions are. So this is something that we're going to be following really closely as we go forward.
Thanks, Stephen. Want to turn a little bit to the health and safety measures that are being implemented currently by a lot of the organizations, as well as the perspective, bring in some AOM data, some audience outlook monitor data, excuse me, to support kind of where organizations are coming from, or perhaps refute where they're coming from in terms of supporting the needs of audiences. So in particular, just right off the head here, we wanted to bring in some of this audience outlook monitor data, sharing the perspective of the audiences. And And we find that 3/4 of audiences in the end of January, early February reported that they expected mask mandates to be required. And yet that is very regional. Obviously, in the Northeast, you see a greater portion of the audiences saying that they expect the mask mandates to be in place, as well as on the West Coast, less so in the Midwest and in the South, as we might expect. And additionally, there's quite a bit of day of uncertainty, as we have already alluded to when we looked at the drop counts, particularly on the coasts. We see a number of patrons in Northeast and the West, a higher percentage of the patrons being concerned that vaccinated only admittance policies are in place. And by the same token, not represented in this data necessarily, but they are also tend to be slightly more concerned about infection rates depending on the conditions. But I think it's important to call out that these patrons are much more inclined to expect vaccinated only admittance policies. And if for whatever reason that shifts or the conditions change, they're more sensitive to those sort of things. So when we turn to the policies that organizations are keeping in place right now, particularly through the end of January and early February, we see that 3/4 of organizations, right, pretty much in line with that audience expectation, have had mask mandates in place. And as I'm sure many of us are aware, that is likely to change or already have changed in the past couple of days, perhaps. Across much of the United States. By the same token, we see that proof of vaccination policy being in place for about 50% of organizations. And that's distinct in this case from a negative COVID test that you see a little bit further down the line there.
And I think we have an interesting conundrum here, right, Christian, which is we see governments removing requirements, but we have an audience population that's still very, very concerned about their health and safety and managing this because it's not uniform, right? There are a percentage of folks who are saying, if the government says I don't need to wear a mask or prove I've been vaccinated, I don't want to do that, or I never wanted to do that. So this is a big conundrum for the field here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting and important observation that to some degree, local and state and federal regulations are controlling people's thinking, and to in another sense, people are quite independent. So really the question is, how is that going to shift and change as the conditions of the pandemic shift and change going forward? Also wanted to bring in yet again some of this perspective that's supported. I think we made reference to this, but particularly things have really remained strong in terms of the audience perspective on vaccinated only admittance policies. And you see there, as of late January, you still had 27% of audiences that would only attend given this policy. And nearly 70%, actually right on the dot, 70% would support these policies as of late January. When we turn back to the organization side and what's being implemented here, we see that is very obviously and significantly driven by the coasts, particularly the proof of vaccination piece. Mask mandates, there's a little bit of variety there as well, and we see that organizations in the South are a little less likely to have these policies in place, but there's a stark difference between the coasts and the middle of the country in terms of employing vaccination only admittance policies in the last month or so. Also interesting to call out the slight differences there when it comes to other types of policies that mitigate COVID, limitations on concessions. You see a little bit more of that happening in the Northeast and in the West than you do in the middle of the country as well. Venues and organizations that control venues in particular, but also from an operational standpoint, a lot of these organizations are employing both permanent improvements to support health and safety, as well as temporary process changes. I think these are pretty interesting figures here. We've got 50% of the organizations, presumably those that control venues, that have made HVAC improvements to support COVID, and those are permanent things that are in place, as well as half that have made permanent enhancements to sanitization procedures. All of those security screening systems are considered temporary, and perhaps they'll go away as the conditions change for some, but 30% have employed those screening procedures for health and safety in particular. And then we see that about 65% are temporarily limiting their food and bev services, but we're curious to see how perhaps some of those practices will shift and change from what the norm was before the pandemic in terms of serving food and beverage in the venues. So what we're seeing overall, and please feel free to chime in here, Stephen, but we're seeing a sector that truly is slow to recover, and perhaps in some ways organizations are ahead of audiences in terms of the recovery, in terms of the projections that we see for sales relative to before the pandemic, in terms of folks that are no-shows being higher relative to before the pandemic. So essentially what that indicates to us is that we see a sector that is taking its time in recovery and needs to be sure to build up confidence among its audience base. We see, as Stephen mentioned, organizations that are becoming fully staffed. And this is a really important observation as well, that will help to prepare for the vector to a full recovery. And yet certainly the organizations are needing to ramp up ahead of where audiences are in any given moment. And then we've also observed, based on the Audience Outlook Monitor data and the way that venues are behaving, that arts audiences do have high expectations when it comes to their health and their safety. So I think we just need to be patient still to this day. Certainly we know that Omicron variant threw a wrench in a lot of plans, and that is rearing itself in terms of the way that audiences are behaving and the sort of things that organizations are having to cope with. Is there anything you'd add to that, Stephen?
Yeah, I think, Christian, that the point here is that things don't happen in parallel, right? We have to build our capacity in advance. It's clear of perhaps people coming back, and that is, I have a feeling from organizations that I'm talking to all the time, an unforeseen condition for a lot of places. There's certainly an economic imbalance that was perhaps not as anticipated as it's turning out to be. I think what's going to be interesting as we go forward with this longitudinal tool is to see how quickly that gap closes, and to start to understand some sort of things and understand what it is perhaps that the field is doing to manage a different economic reality than they experienced in 2019, and how the various lines of support for those who got it are going to be helpful, and what those who didn't will also understand. I think that this first survey is kind of narrow. It's just baseline data, and it's really focused on change. So we'll have much more to report the next time, and we want to get to everyone's questions. Just two things I want to put out there for folks to think about as we go forward. One, I was inadvertently left out Arts Midwest and the Western Arts Alliance, who had respondents also in the sample that we sent invitations to. I do want to remind everybody that APAP regularly circulates news about this survey, and there is a general link. Even if your colleagues out there did not get a direct invitation, we hope they did, but they certainly can participate through the general link that's available. And it's going to be very, very important to keep the number of responses up as we go through the next month, so that the data is reliable. Krista posed an interesting question, and I'd invite her back onto the screen here as well as we go forward here. That it would be an interesting idea to suggest to folks, what did you see missing from the survey? Are there other things that you would like us to gather data on, things that you think are more important? There was a really good question in the chat about expenses. We didn't ask a lot about expenses, and we certainly will find a way to put that in as we go forward. But as we're going through the Q&A here, if folks want to think about what else they'd like to see us ask, please feel free to share that now or afterwards. And Chris, I'll turn it over to you to help us with the Q&A, I think.
Sure, thank you for that. And yes, this is the first time that I know APAP has been involved with this kind of study. So it's a really great opportunity, given that, the APAP umbrella is a broad and large one, and our constituencies are very mixed, but it's one way to really get a broader picture of all facets of our industry, because all of us are integral to coming back and resuming our activity and recovering. So I'm excited about this first iteration. Thank you, Stephen and Christian, for your work on this, and thank you all for being here and for posing important questions to help us refine some of our questions on this, so that we can give you data that can help inform decision making. Some of the questions that we haven't yet answered, I'd like to raise up. One is a question about monitoring onboarding practices and duration in the workforce section of the study. In fact, there are two questions around the workforce pieces that have come up. That is, what about onboarding practices and duration? And then also from Samantha Pollock, she asked, I'm intrigued about this stat which says compensations for presumably new hires, has gone up 10 to 40%. Has there been, or could there be, a follow-up as to how orgs are absorbing these higher expenses as they relate to largely reduced revenue?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers there, Krista. Please don't misinterpret the data we shared. We don't know how much compensation has gone up, and we don't know whether it was for new hires or returning folks. Excuse me, we didn't ask those questions yet. I think actually, because we want to explore expenses, excuse me, we will also explore how those expenses are getting offset: higher ticket prices, more fundraising, release from endowment. Who knows what those categories could be, but we will think about that for the next edition. As for monitoring onboarding practices, we're a little bit limited in the scope of what we can do in this study, mostly so it doesn't get too long that people stop responding to us regularly. This is really not a workforce study. It is an activity and operations analysis. I think we will try to find a way to get some kind of question in there, but I would absolutely, I know that Meg Friedman is listening in today. I'll punt this over to our friends at Return to the Stage. I know they're looking for something that might happen next with that work as it moves forward, and maybe this is a question that they can pick up. Yeah.
It's an important intersection, right? The whole workforce piece that Megan and David lifted up for us, and that we highlighted it at the conference as a bigger piece of just how the industry is working. But there are intersections, right? So because we can't do our work, we can't reopen, we can't recover without the people. So how are we making sure that we're staffed and have the kind of capacity that we need to resume and recover in the way that the field demands, the audience demands. So there's an interesting intersection there that we hope to dig into a little bit as we're able. Ed Kirchdorfer also asked a question about have we thought about asking questions as to whether venues modified refund or exchange policies, or frankly, any kind of new policies that they've instituted as a result of post-pandemic reopening?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to go. We do know from some other research that we've been doing for quite a long time now with major performing arts centers that, in fact, in that space, there has been a lot of change, right? There's been a much more flexible response to keeping revenue in the house, if you will. But I think, Ed, that's a great question for us to add here. So we'll follow that up.
There are also some technical or suggestions about ways that can improve or help respondents answer. One is how, is there a tool or some way to capture data in real time as they're as they're doing their work. You know, maybe that's a house manager's report, maybe it's something else, but welcome ideas about that if that's something that would be helpful and useful for you to reference as you're participating in the survey. And then this other suggestion is there a save and stop option to allow for working on surveys over multiple days, which might increase response rates.
Well, I'll let Christian answer that one because he's the survey guru.
I believe there should be the ability to save and stop in the platform that we've been using. I will verify that. Do we have a record of who asked that question in particular? But I guess for the general record, you should be capable of saving and stopping and resuming. But if you have a question about that, please reach out to us.
Yep.
Yeah, I asked Laura for her email address and we'll follow up. But the platform we use, which is called Key Survey, does allow you to go back into a survey if you haven't pushed the submit button, I think, right, Christian? But we'll send a note out to everybody confirming that. The issue about data collection is one of those things that warms my heart. Anytime someone says, you know, is there an easier way or a better way to collect data? I think that the question here is a challenge for the sector, and I'm going to get a little bit on a soapbox. It's a priorities question, right? We have a lot of things competing for the resources that everybody has to do running their organization from day to day. There are some tools that are out there that help people capture data in real time. I'd be interested if anyone wants to comment that's listening or in any of the follow-up about how you use your ticketing systems to capture the data that we asked for. I think we tried to design the survey in a way that we thought the data would be regularly available from some kind of periodic, you know, monthly, quarterly, annual reporting. And it's interesting if I can, Laura, if it's okay to cover your point about you went back and looked at the 2019 data and you said, I wonder if that's accurate. But it might be a good technical assistance direction for us to go, Krista, about practical and affordable tools that members in the field might use to keep this data, because we do think it's actually, these are the kinds of things that internally you should be monitoring really regularly. And as a field, we tend to take a lot of pictures, moments in time, but we don't do a very good job at looking over time. And certainly Christian and I and our colleagues believe that that movie is where the real richness is and illustrates to us about change. Because otherwise we're responding to an instance as opposed to a shift.
Really excellent point. Well, the last 2 years have taught us a lot about things that we don't know and things that we need to know, and raised up, you know, gaps for how we kind of capture and assess how we're doing. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for us to fill in those gaps through this partnership, and feedback like what you're offering to those in the audience. So thank you so much for that. I don't see any other questions, but I do want to raise a couple of things here. I made the assumption that everyone knows that ArtsForward has two components, and I want to just make sure that I clarify that. You know, this portion of our ArtsForward initiative is information and resource based to support the field in its reopening with data and webinars and other useful, timely information to support that effort. The other half is the very generous $2.2 million that we have awarded to presenting organizations in partnership with artists in terms of reopening, and we'll be announcing those shortly. But we are incredibly thankful and full of gratitude for our ability to get money out into the field, and for the presenters and artists and agents and managers and producers who are supporting them to reimagine how they come back to communities and the different ways that they're doing that. So I just wanted to underscore that, and more information about that cohort that has been funded and the ways and things that they're learning along the way will be part of our sharing of information. This represented our first report out of presenters. The next survey that we'll be implementing will be for agents, artists, managers, and producers. And I believe that survey will go live March 8th. And so you will be agents and managers, producers, artists, and those who work with them. Please share that information and please participate widely, only once, but widely and actively to encourage participation in this survey process is something we take very seriously. The more people that participate in all 4 rounds of the survey, the more robust and more accurate and more rich our information will be for the field writ large. And just to encourage you to do so, I did want to let you know that if you are one of those who agree to participate in all 4 rounds, you are entered into a chance to win a $500 gift card for your organization. We're giving away 10, but only if you do all 4 rounds, and 10 free conference registrations for 2023. So hopefully that's enough of incentive, and even if it's not, in the goodness of your heart and the fact that this is really, you're a part of a community of people that loves this field, and we're all in it together, and we're all going to come back together, but we can't do that if we don't have your voice a part of that. So that's my plug for being a part of that. I think with that might be all of the questions. Thank you, Laura, for your comment. Laura Howell raised the point that she loves data, but it's like so many of us that work in the field, we don't always have a chance to participate. So I'm glad that this is a way to do so. We appreciate you all being here. We will send another survey out for this webinar, just to sort of get a sense from you that the impact of this survey and how it was and what you'd like to see differently. So please click the link in the chat. Stephen and Christian, do you have any final thoughts?
Just one thing, Krista, before we go. Of course, to thank our partners at Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, really, really important, and their commitment to data. The information that is used here is informing practices and ideas across the sector, and I think that ought to be the motivation to do the survey on behalf of the field. I think it's great that there's some incentives out there, but the more we learn and the smarter we are as a sector, the better we will be able to respond to the curveballs that we're all facing on a daily basis. And I encourage folks to remind colleagues that this is out there, that maybe they didn't respond to it this time, but they can respond to it next time. The more data we have, the more representative it is of the field, the more conclusions that we can draw. And I think that's really important. This is an effort for APAP that has been a direction that you guys have wanted to go. So thank you to the whole team there for finding a way to make this happen. It's a really important service to the field right now. We're glad to be your partners in that. And we encourage everybody to send feedback, suggestions. If we can't accommodate them in this particular piece of work, we'll find places to point them. So thank you very much for today. And we look forward to the next. Look out, our friends in the agents, producers, managers, and artists world. A week from today, right, Christian? The survey will be hitting your inboxes, and it's a slightly different survey. So please, as Krista said, no stuffing the ballot boxes. Everybody answer your survey during your window. Thank you again, Stephen and Christian. You're great partners and leaders in the field, and we're so thankful for all of the skill and expertise that you bring and that you give. And we're particularly excited to be working with you. So thank you for your work. And thank you all for being here. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and we'll talk with you soon. Oh, and tomorrow we have Real Talk in Real Time at 4 o'clock. So if you haven't registered, please go to our website and learn more about how you can be a part of that. Thanks so much.